right. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Kiersten Wise. I am an extension plant pathologist with the University of Kentucky. And today I'm joined by two specialists, Dr. Alyssa Collins and Dr. Tamra Jackson-Ziems. And we are going to be talking about tar spot in our emerging areas. And so we are all in states where tar spot has been found more recently than some of the states in the Midwest. And so we're just going to talk a little bit today about what we're seeing, what our perspectives are, how we're speaking with our farmers about tar spot in the areas where it's just starting to get established. And so I'm going to kick it over to Alyssa and have her talk about her experiences with tar spot in the Northeast.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm based in Pennsylvania, and our agriculture around here is largely diversified, but we do have a lot of corn. And a lot of that corn then goes ahead and goes to silage, but then also grain. So we're farming in a mostly diversified situation, but also we have a lot of no-till production and not very much irrigation on our field crops. So I'm just going to swap this so you guys can see what we're looking at. So I just put up here the map as it exists in the US currently for tar spot. So every county that's being lit up is being lit up in order of how we first discovered it, going back to 2016. And you can see the origin there. That's where a lot of the action has been in the Midwest in terms of research and awareness. But you can also now see that we're reaching out into those far reaches into the east and south and west of its origins. And that's where we're from. So looking at that slide, I'll tell you a little bit about how we came to discover it in Pennsylvania, and what we think this means for surrounding states too. So this is the beginnings of tar spot for us in Pennsylvania and ultimately the rest of the Northeast, because Pennsylvania is where it came to first. And this was in 2020. And so in 2020, I got a call from an allied industry provider, so someone who works in the ag industry, who is scouting some plots to the west of me, only like 10 minutes to the west of me, so really close to where I farm and run a research center, and said, hey, listen, I think it looks like we've got tar spot out here. He was looking at some research plots that were for a private company, and so they were all different hybrids. And he was actually from the Midwest, so he knew what he was looking at. So I went right out there, and sure enough, it was positively tar spot. And this was at the very end of the season. These plots were about to be harvested literally the next day. So we knew the impact was not going to be really very important. But it also told us, okay, we better be looking for this next year. So the following year, 2021, yes, we did see it again in Lancaster County. And this is really the breadbasket of Pennsylvania and much of the Northeast. A lot of ag activity happens here. And so there's a lot of interest because folks come to and from here with agricultural products. It's kind of an important area to keep your eye on. It did indeed spread to the surrounding counties. And then you can also probably see that we've got an area up in the Northwest here. And that's a pretty big jump, right? So we didn't expect that this was a result of this infection down here. It was probably coming across Lake Erie from our friends in Ontario who experienced a similar pattern to what we did starting in 2020. In 2022, so this is just last year, it spread further into Western PA, looking at these counties over here, kept spreading in the northwest part of Pennsylvania, and then also that year into New York and Northern Maryland. So we're starting to affect the states around us, perhaps, and it seems like we don't have any trouble getting this pathogen to survive and overwinter and be really happy in our region. 2023, here's where we're at now. It's really ubiquitous in Pennsylvania. We could find it in pretty much every, corn county that we're growing corn in. Those where we haven't found it yet, we probably just don't have that many people looking for it, or maybe they thought it was already reported. We got further spread into New York, into Delaware, so lower Delaware here. And then actually it's not lit up here, but the western part of New Jersey. So when this first detection happened, we wanted to know, where do we think this came from? And so this is all anecdotal, but we're pretty sure that it didn't get here naturally. It probably had a little bit of man-made help in the form of moving agricultural products around. And the reason for this is that same week that it was detected in the hybrid plots in Western Lancaster County, it was detected in very similar hybrid plots in Ontario. And also I got a call from another set of hybrid plots down the road from me where it was also detected just that same week. So we're pretty sure it moved here in probably some of the residue from pre-commercial releases. Now, would it have gotten here eventually? Almost certainly. So we shouldn't gang up on any, one set of operators, but it was going to get here. It just happened to get here then all at the same time. It was really low impact that year. It was not something that was going to impact yield. And honestly, in 2021, that was pretty much also the case. There were a few growers who had high incidence, high severity, but largely across the board, it was not a huge issue, but it did make people think, and people started to build awareness among growers and among industry professionals. So since then, we've had a lot of help from those industry professionals in keeping track of it. Since we have gotten spread ever since then, we know it's going to stay with us. It seems to like our region, but there's a lot we don't know, right? So we're relying on self-reporting now because we don't have an extensive network of people who are out there scouting actively. It's basically self-reporting and, tell me how bad it is. And it's really variable from what we can tell. So the disease levels, you might find one spot, or you might have a field that is just riddled with it. Really variable disease levels, also really variable yield impact. It looks like timing is a really important factor here, and that's something we need to learn a lot more about. So in terms of when it's going to show up, we still have a lot of questions about that, about weather and how that affects it, all the way to, we've got people who want to spray. When do we spray? Do I have to spray when the aerial applicator is going to be in my area just because they're here, not necessarily because I have the disease? How long is it going to be till dry down? A lot of questions around timing. And I think that's where a lot of people feel underinformed. A lot of our growers are choosing to spray, but we're still not quite sure of the effects of that and how economical they are. Lots of times guys don't leave a test strip, and we'd really like to get that information. So we're comparing apples to apples. Our strategies currently are, is it going to affect your yield every year? Probably not. So we're starting to think about it like we think about other foliar diseases like gray leaf spot. We know we're going to have it usually every year to a different extent, but it's probably not going to be profitable to spray for it every year. So let's try to manage what we can, which doesn't cost us a great deal. Scouting, choosing hybrids with your seed dealer that may have some resistance to tar spot. If you do spray, leave a test strip so you can figure out how well that did for you. And then we're also talking about maybe spreading our risk in terms of planting dates, hybrid, relative maturities, things like that. And we can, I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversation about that. But our pressing questions are still many. How is infection this year going to affect me next year? How much help can we expect to get from any different fungicide program? When do we spray? When do we spray in relation to when we get the disease? If we've gotten the disease, how many days to harvest? And we're having a lot of trouble getting enough disease in our fungicide trials, which is a sick thing to say, right? But only people like us want to get disease in a certain field and try and throw everything at it to try and get that disease and still don't get it. So those are some of the challenges we still have, among others. And I'll kind of open it up and throw it to one of my colleagues here to tell us about their experience.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. I just want to ask a couple questions while I have you, because I'm interested to know what people's reactions have been over the last few years. Have your farmers and have your stakeholders sort of settled into this is something that we can deal with, or is there still some tinges of panic about having tar spot when they find it, or is it all of those emotions in everybody's response?
Yeah, I think it depends on how long they've been dealing with it and how informed they are. So some folks who haven't really been thinking about it, who maybe aren't in this south central region of Pennsylvania, find it and say, oh, do you need to know about this? And aren't very concerned. Sometimes they're very concerned because they don't have personal experience with it. So it really varies. The people who tend to text me a lot with pictures, like I found one, are some of our younger ag industry professionals, which is great. But they've gotten really, really good at finding it. And I think over the course of doing that the whole season, they're starting to also see how great the variability is and how unpredictable it is to say, okay, I found it here, therefore I'm going to get a huge yield hit. Or, hey, I found it, why didn't I get a huge yield hit? They're starting to kind of internalize a lot of the variables that may go into the impact of tar spot that we don't really have a great handle on yet.
Yeah. And I'm also wondering, when you talked about occasionally they'll use fungicide applications, is that mostly a tasseling application in Pennsylvania, or what's that timing that your farmers would hit for tar spot or other disease management?
Yeah, so typically we would recommend that tasseling timing, but sometimes it just doesn't quite line up very well with custom applicators or aerial applicators. So for instance, I got a call pretty early. It was early July this year, I think, and this extension educator said, "Hey, I've got a grower who wants to know if they should line up a spray because the guy is going to be in their area to spray this week." I'm like, okay, so let's figure out what your risk factors are. What's the growth stage? And, it was pre-tassel. Is there tar spot there yet or any other foliar disease? No. What are the chances that, that would actually help them at that time? It was pretty low. So we said, yeah, it's probably not worth lining up that spray at this time. And if it were me, if it were my farm, I would probably try and push that spray as far back as I could so I can maintain activity as long into the green fill that I could. But again, this is coming from just trying to hedge our bets and spread our risk. It doesn't necessarily come from real data yet because we don't really have that in the Northeast quite yet.
Right. And I think that's probably all three of us are sort of dealing with that, trying to adapt those recommendations from our I states and Wisconsin and Michigan, which have a good body of data, but trying to figure out how those recommendations apply in our individual states has been a challenge. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm going to share my Kentucky experience with you guys, get this going here. And I have the same slide that Alyssa, this is a slide we all like to use when we describe sort of the progression of tar spot over time. And this is a slide that's put together by our corn IPM pipe. And although this is kind of showing you that spread over time, if anyone's ever interested in where tar spot is in the US during the growing season, we do populate those confirmed findings on this website in real time during the growing season. So it's a resource that anyone can use to sort of know where tar spot is when they're trying to make management decisions. And just like Alyssa mentioned, you can kind of watch it go over time throughout those areas. And for us in Kentucky, our first find was in 2021. We had it in 2 states or 2 counties, very similar to Alyssa. The combine is going through the field, and then they see this pocket and they say, what is this? And that's how we sort of started finding tar spot. Now, in Kentucky, so far, we've had it for 3 years. Only 1 county have we had it multiple years, and that's Lincoln County. And so our original finds in 2021, we scouted the fields around it in 2022. Those fields went back into corn in 2023. We did not find tar spot in those fields in 2023. So that was a relief a little bit that we didn't have the disease, or at least that we could find in those fields. That does not mean that they're out of the woods, but I think it just speaks to some of that environmental variability, those things that we're still trying to learn about. In all of our finds in Kentucky, all of them have come in September. So that's really the month over the last 3 years that we've been able to pick up tar spot. And the good news for Kentucky farmers is that has been too late to impact yield. Our harvest is often, going full swing in September. And so that's really good news, is that it's arriving, or we're seeing it kind of confirmed so far at a point where it's not having much of an impact on yield. But the reason that it's concerning would be for like these popular press or ag press headlines. Like I pulled a few from some that I had seen go across my screen from Wisconsin and Illinois. When our farmers are hearing about, 40 to 50 or even 60 bushel acre yield loss from this disease in some of these states, I mean, it can really cause a lot of concern. And so I think that even though we haven't seen yield loss, even though it hasn't gotten really established until late in the season in Kentucky, there is still a lot of angst about the potential that this disease could have for Kentucky corn. And one of the things that I found really helpful when I was trying to think about putting all of this in perspective for my state was I went back to this map in a model that was put together by our colleagues in Mexico way back in 2015 when we first confirmed tar spot in the US. And you all remember that tar spot has been in the mountains of Mexico for over 100 years, right? So they've dealt with it at their higher altitude corn production areas for a long time. And so they do have good climate data, at least for Mexico and Central America, for how to predict this disease. And so I sort of went back to this and looked at the model, and they're saying, anywhere you see those dark red counties, what that's showing is that based on their climate models, there's a 70 to 100% chance that tar spot infection can occur if the fungus is there and the environmental conditions are favorable. And if you go back to that corn IPM map, one of the things that's been really interesting is how well those two things mirror each other, right? So if you're looking at where that deep red and the red and even the yellow are kind of spreading out, it really mirrors what we've been seeing in the US. For us, this has been something that I've tried to show our farmers in Kentucky that, okay, based on the Mexico models, which, again, we're not 100% sure how those translate here, but it is a source of information that we can use. And it's saying that there's maybe around a little less than 50% chance that if the fungus is there, and if the conditions are favorable, we might have infection. And so that puts us sort of in a almost like a flip a coin situation about whether or not we might have tar spots show up in Kentucky. But when I was really thinking about, talking to my farmers about this disease, is that, Kentucky is a state that annually has to deal with the threat of southern rust. Southern rust can be an explosive disease under the optimum environmental conditions. Within 10 days, you can have reinfection once the disease gets established, and it can be very yield limiting. And we manage it using fungicides. So there's a lot of similarities to me between southern rust and tar spot, at least when I'm trying to pull some parallels for people that are trying to understand tar spot in context to corn production. And I always tell our Kentucky farmers, they're very good at managing southern rust. They know how to do that. And when we're managing southern rust, in a way, we're also managing tar spot. One of our biggest challenges in a state that deals with both southern rust and tar spot is identification. And so I have this picture here of one of the things that we see when we scout in August and September in Kentucky. And so you can kind of see here, we have, let me see if I can get my pointer here. We have these orange kind of pustules here that are pretty obvious to anyone who's familiar with diagnosing southern rust, that we have those. But then if you look close, we have all these black dots in there as well. And if you run your finger along that leaf, it's going to feel bumpy, just like the tar spot fungal structures. And so that has been something that when we see that, it's very hard to know, is it tar spot or is it southern rust? And so I have a comparison here. I mean, this particular sample gave everyone a lot of heartburn, because just looking at it in the field, it really looked like tar spot. And then here's a picture of tar spot right next to it for comparison. It's very hard to know sometimes in the field what you have. But the good news is we can take it back to the lab and we can look at it under a good compound microscope. And within minutes, you'll know the difference, because the fungal structures of each different fungus look very different under the microscope, right? So that was the good news, is that with a good lab, we can tell the difference. But in the field, it can be very hard. And I just have a couple other pictures here of southern rust this last year, which in pockets of Kentucky was very severe. And so you can see those structures. If you're out there just walking the field, you might look at that and say, wait, is that tar spot? So having both diseases in the state can cause a little bit of troubles with trying to diagnose some of those things. At least in Kentucky right now, when we think about managing it, if they're managing southern rust, they're also managing tar spot, right? So if you're using that fungicide application between tasseling and blister to manage southern rust, which a good majority of our farmers do, that is also a timing that will protect against tar spot. And, I've had people ask me, is that maybe why we haven't confirmed more tar spot in Kentucky? And that's a very feasible reason that we haven't seen more tar spot, is that a lot of acres are already receiving a fungicide application for diseases like gray leaf spot and southern rust. Now, Alyssa mentioned this, the goal would be to have good hybrid resistance. In the South, I know that the southern adapted hybrids are not going to be the focus right now. I know they're focusing on resistance in more northern adapted hybrids. But I know that's the goal, is if we could plant something that has resistance, it would alleviate a lot of concerns about the disease. And I always get asked the question about what products would work. And we do have our fungicide efficacy guide that we put together through the Crop Protection Network. It's usually released every February. And what I've told my farmers is the products that they're choosing for southern rust control also generally work well against tar spot. So again, by managing the one disease that we know is an annual threat, they're probably also managing an emerging threat as well. And so I'll stop sharing and I'll ask Tamra, because I know Nebraska is also a state that deals with both southern rust and tar spot. And so I'm interested if you were seeing some of those Telia and having some diagnostic issues as well.
Well, we have, and thank you, Kirsten and Alyssa, for those updates. And a lot of what you both said really applies to us too in Nebraska and the Great Plains. And you're right, southern rust, we can find it every year somewhere in Nebraska. It's not always a widespread problem, but during certain years, it has created tremendous losses for us, under irrigation especially. And so early on, tar spot first made its way into eastern Nebraska in 2021. And as we were beating the bushes, so to speak, looking for, because we knew it was coming over probably that year, in communication with our colleagues from Iowa, we did have a hard time. We found Telia. We had some southern rust move up along that eastern edge, and it's hard for us too, right, when you see that. And so it's not until you can get it back under the scope that you feel confident about your diagnosis. So if anything, that's I think a good takeaway for viewers of this webinar, that don't necessarily be fooled, because it's hard for everyone to tell these apart. And there's even a few other things. I think I've looked at more bug poop in the last 3 years than I ever have before. That's been the most common thing for us out here to be misdiagnosed as tar spot.
I sometimes tell people, if you look at the pictures on my phone in season, you might think I'm an entomologist. Like how much bug poop is on my phone, right? Like, yeah.
Me,
I
me
think
too.
for a lot of people, where we've had dry periods, I think the bug poop has been a really exciting part of tar spot diagnosis, because the longer it stays dry, the more bug poop accumulates, and because it just doesn't wash off. And so you pair that with people who don't have any disease to look at and are just bringing things like, is this it? Like, no. But we actually do have, we don't really get southern rust, but we get some common rust at the end of the year, and that almost fooled me this year at just right at harvest, where we thought we were confirming another county, and it turned out to be common rust. So this is still something that I think we all work through in terms of what could it be. But I think there's a lot of expertise out there now, especially in the industry, to help with that too. Even if you can't get to an extension specialist, there's a lot of people out there that can give you a second opinion.
Right.
Kiersten, I think your message about the tools that we have to control other diseases are also the same ones that are going to be really useful for tar spot. And so we've been talking about that here in the Northeast, in that, okay, you might not choose the same product exactly. You might choose something that's got 2 or 3 modes of action, where you might have previously chosen something with 1 mode of action that's a little bit cheaper for a gray leaf spot. I think now we're probably leaning towards those slightly more expensive applications, but knowing that will also give us control of gray leaf spot and northern corn leaf blight for here in the Northeast. And that's one of the things that I think helped keep people from having their hair on fire over the last couple of years, as we see it really get established, is that, we do have fungicides. We know how to use them. And it's not like we're limited to 1 mode of action, 1 particular product that there's going to be a run on. Maybe you would sell more product in the winter if it was just 1 product, but no, there's a lot of options. So we don't have to worry so much there. For us, it's a challenge of getting across the field at tassel. That is hard for us in such a variable landscape, because it's more difficult to get aerial applicators out here. And there's only so many high boys to go around.
Yeah, that can really be a concern. And I also am really glad that, again, that I'm not in one of the I states or Wisconsin or Michigan, but I'm really glad that they're doing a lot of the efficacy work, that they have more consistent disease pressure. So we know how these products work against the tar spot fungus and what we should really expect from them when we have this in other states. And so we know we can manage it with fungicides, like you said, but having these states that have the consistent disease pressure really helps us know, okay, well, if we had a problem, what could we use? And so I think being able to pull from those recommendations has helped a lot.
Yeah, I think that helped us be much more prepared than we would have otherwise been. Grateful to all the work being done in the heart of tar spot country.
Yeah.
Likewise.
Now, Tamra, you mentioned irrigation, and your state, I know, is very pivot heavy. And so have you seen differences in tar spot development in your irrigated areas versus the dry land production?
We definitely have, and that's going to be a big factor for us, especially in Nebraska, maybe to a lesser extent in the other Great Plains states. Excuse me. That might be a good segue into a few slides and maybe some maps that might help better explain some of this too, because there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, but it's definitely going to be a high risk factor for us. And so I'll try to share those now. Everybody seeing that okay? All right. Well, I have just a variation of some of the same slides that you folks showed, and I really love that that map that shows the active spread from the Illinois and Indiana area. And I watched it. I paid more attention, I guess, this time to it going west because we've been watching this thing. Basically, I feel like we're standing on the eastern edge of Nebraska since 2015, 16, and 17, watching to the east as it approaches. And in 2018 and 19, it really raced its way across Iowa. And in 2019, it was right along the western edge of Iowa, and it was very dry later that year and into 2020 and the early part of 21. And so we didn't see movement of disease of the pathogen. We didn't see reemergence of tar spot until the end of 21. And we got in a weather pattern where we were seeing a lot of moisture. And finally, working with colleagues like Darren Mueller and Ed Zworski over there, we knew it was starting to flare up in western Nebraska, and that we knew it was time that it was probably going to make its way across the river. And so we really all started to watch these easternmost counties along the eastern edge of Nebraska. And that was the first week of October. And suddenly we were able to find it in about every field we went into, but it was very, very light. And so that year, I doubt anybody else noticed it except for down in this extreme southeast corner. See, we were watching for it in the northeast part of Nebraska because of what we knew was happening over into Iowa. We almost disregarded that corner down here in southeast Nebraska because there really wasn't any indication yet of its presence in western Missouri. And so that's when that same week we received a sample from that area, and it was loaded with tar spot, and it shocked all of us. And this was from a rep that said, I think that's what we had last year too. And so this is probably an example of a multi-year infestation, or, where we didn't know it yet and it slipped across on us. And so because it was so late, and we had a late freeze that year, we were able to find some. I think 8 counties in 2021, but very light in most cases. Definitely no impact on yield that year. But it was good to show people what it looks like and to remind them that, if it made its way as far west as I think we were looking out here into, kind of getting 3 or 4 counties deep into the state, that there's probably tar spot over many more of these counties than people had found. And so that was a good reminder, a good lesson for us. And then the next year in 2022, we watched very closely, and it showed up a little bit earlier in this last year. It showed up in 2022. And so, as you might imagine, the counties further east had more tar spot than we did in those counties further west. And when I talk to people about it, I describe it like a tidal wave or a tsunami of spores kind of pushing across to the west. And if they find a county or when they were looking at the map and it was speckled up, they might have a false sense of hope or and thinking that they were safe if it was west of us, but not in their county. But the reality is, if we look hard enough, I think we'll start finding it more, and they did. And so in 2022, we were up to a cumulative, 31 counties by then. And so then 2023 came around, and the early part of this year was exceptionally dry. We had a pretty intense drought in most of the state. But the thing is that we have a lot of pivot irrigation, sprinkler overhead irrigation, and we knew that would be a risk factor for us. And so the question is how much? And when I look at the map that you just showed, that was predicting what part of the country would be the most supportive for tar spot, we knew that would be the case naturally. But that map can't take into account all the irrigation that we have across much of Nebraska. And so there's another layer there. And so by the end of this season, we've confirmed it now in 47 counties in Nebraska, but also in my bordering states of South Dakota up here. They've got a half a dozen counties. It wasn't as active up there in my communication with colleague Madeline Shires. They didn't see as much this year in that southeast corner of South Dakota. But in the northeast corner of Kansas, colleague Rodrigo Onofre, he's saying there was a lot more there. And so this is something that I kind of want to highlight, is we had a real hot spot in that tri-state area of northwest Missouri, northeast Kansas, and southeast Nebraska. And as we talked more, and then we eventually all met and spent a day in that area touring, I saw the most severe tar spot I've ever seen. And I had seen some before in Iowa and Indiana, and when I traveled to other things over there. And so it was a surprise to see it so badly in that part of of our geographic area. But realistically, the weather pattern in that part of the state was much more favorable. And so they had some adequate and frequent showers early on, and they actually confirmed it as early as that V8 to V10 timing. And many of those fields were treated during that time period, and then they continued to have frequent showers. And although there is some irrigation, in that part of the world that definitely supports disease development, they were getting enough favorable weather that it really did blow up in some parts of that tri-state area. And so throughout the rest of the season, they saw it continuing to get worse and worse. And some fields, of course, were sprayed 0 times, but then other fields were sprayed once, 2 times, or even 3 times in that area. And so I think it took folks by surprise down there. And so we saw an awful lot of disease there. So we know there'll be a lot of overwintering in that area, and that they may, be more cognizant of it, especially. But I think in general, you asked about how people are really reacting and feel about this. The alarm varies according, to where you're at, and anywhere from, people maybe still are not aware of it, but in many cases, people are very cognizant of it. And just like you said, in Nebraska, we have a lot of areas where fields are sprayed every year at that VTR1 timing. And so that's going to be helpful for managing a number of diseases, including tar spot. But here too, I think we're going to see that late flush of disease, where eventually we might see that it's worn off by then. And it'll require us to look more closely at disease development and that timing, because I feel like a lot of the concern is about application timing. When do we spray to get the best effect? And in cases where people are aggressive, and especially in these irrigated fields, and people are starting to spray multiple times, we have little to no data to back up those timings too. And so there's a lot of alarm about that, and questions. And like I was saying, yeah, we do see the teleal phase here too. That southern rust is going to make it really hard for us in these areas where it's just moving into. But something else we noticed this year, we had a lot more of those saprophytic, the beneficial fungi toward the end of the season. And we had a lot of showers right there at the end and dew. And so we saw a lot of black spots show up on a lot of these senesced leaves. And so that created quite a bit of panic as people wanted to blame some yield loss on tar spot when actually it was actually some of the beneficial fungi. And again, just like you both mentioned, we can easily tell what these are under the microscope. And so I'd encourage everyone listening, if you have any doubt at all, let's get that to somebody who can take a closer look and tell you exactly what you're dealing with before you make some decisions on how to handle it. We're, of course, recommending everyone in these areas, though, to start looking more critically at hybrid selection because we know some hybrids react much better than others. And so that's going to be, I think, our first line of defense. And you can start that now in the winter months in making those selections. And I also, want to think more about as this pathogen moves further west and, looking at that predictive map, it showed little to no risk, say, to western Nebraska. But that again doesn't take into account high risk like the irrigation that we do have out there. And so that's something to consider. We know that the climate is much more arid in those areas, but we are altering that a great deal with our irrigation. And I keep bringing that up because we've known for a while, of course, leaf wetness is going to impact diseases, making them worse. And even some anecdotal evidence from our colleagues over in Michigan showed us that under the pivot, tar spot can be much worse. And so this was one of the scariest pictures I'd ever seen when we first started showing this and got this from Marty and Dan. And so it's like a photo in an inverse photo, like a negative when I look at this. Normally in Nebraska, when it's really dry like this year, it's green under the pivot and it's brown in the corners. And so this was really scary seeing how quickly tar spot took over this irrigated pivot. I mean, there's some disease in the corner that you can make out over there on the left side, but certainly this is something worth considering. And I didn't leave the numbers in, but in spite of how bad it looks at the time this photo was made, yields were still bumping 200 bushels in parts of the field and across most of it because it came in very late. And so I think people aren't considering that when it comes in has a big impact on what the impact is going to be on your yield and of course leaf area. And so that's something we've tried to spend more time talking about. And looking more closely, I keep talking about irrigation in this part of the country. It's just critical for us because of our precipitation gradient. And so Nebraska has the most irrigated acres in the country, and it's largely because we're situated over the deepest and biggest part of the Ogallala Aquifer, like you can see in that map on the right. But that aquifer extends down all the way into Texas, down through the Panhandle, and so these areas have access to good water underground, and we're using it. And we couldn't have reliable corn production and other crops without it. And so this is a wonderful benefit to us, but how we manage irrigation is going to really impact the other problems associated with it, not just tar spot, but other diseases. There's other questions too. You look at irrigation, look at regular, annual precipitation. Our precipitation gradient is extreme here in Nebraska and the Great Plains, anywhere from, as little as 10 to 12 inches per year out in the western panhandle out here. But in the east, we're probably over 34, often over 40 inches per year, probably not this year with the drought that we had. But I think unexpected for most people is also the altitude change across the state. And so when you travel west in the Nebraska and the Great Plains, for about every 100 miles west, you have about a 1,000-foot increase in elevation. So very gradual, imperceptible, all the way to western Nebraska where it's over 5,000 feet. And so that really changes our cropping systems. And the pathogens that we're dealing with and the arid nature that we've got out there. And so there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen as it pushes deeper into the state. You know, we're about the midway point right now for tar spot, and that is one of the heaviest irrigated parts of the state where we're providing that moisture. But as it travels further west, it remains to be seen. You know, in Mexico, at those higher elevations, it seemed like it was very happy there. And so I think there's a strong chance we could have significant disease out here in western Nebraska too. And so I think a lot of people have told me, well, we're not going to have to worry about that because it's so dry out here. And I think we need to hold on to that a little bit and hold that judgment, because there's a lot that remains to be seen. So that kind of looks at what we're looking at here, and we're starting to look at disease development under pivot irrigation too, and different things we might be able to change with irrigation equipment and scheduling and things that maybe we can have some answers on how to face that better in the future.
That
Yeah.
pivot photo is so striking. And you mentioned the yield hit was not what you would get the feeling was coming out of that particular photo, and the differences in appearance. And we're experiencing kind of the same thing out here. I get a lot of photos, side-by-sides, comparisons of a field that got sprayed versus one that didn't get sprayed. Typically, they're not in a trial situation, so it might be a different hybrid, might be a different planting date, but the impact is visual, right? But it might not necessarily be at the bin wagon. And we're starting to see some of that when we ask that question, you know, okay, well, what did it do, you know, on the yield monitor? And, oh, well, you know, it really does depend on when it came in and then the weather subsequent to that, it seems like. But we don't really have enough data yet to say in what situation that'll be problematic.
I completely agree. And data take time, right? And so we'll continue to accumulate that and work as hard as and fast as we can.
So Tamra, I was curious, you talked about your tri-state area with Kansas and Missouri and how farmers maybe were having to spray 3 times. Did you get any yield loss data back from that where it was really severe?
We haven't yet. I've requested that, and so I hope to have that back in time for some later winter meetings. And so, especially in some of those fields that were side by side where we had 0 to 1 applications versus 2 or 3. And so that'll really, I think, tell the tale. So we're still waiting on some of those.
Yeah, I think that will be interesting and very similar to what Alyssa mentioned about the yield hit, because you all know 2 fungicide applications, especially if they're aerial applied with a product, maybe more of the premium products that have 2 or 3 fungicide classes, you know, that's going to be like a $68 an acre application for 2 passes. So that's a lot of yield. And I know everyone is interested in protecting the yield, and we think about them maybe more as insurance applications to try to prevent yield loss. But when we're thinking about return on investment and sort of the bottom line math of making those applications work, you know, those are very expensive investments, and I'm interested to sort of see how it plays out.
The other thing I am interested about is the unintended consequences of late applications. So we know we get close to, you know, our post-harvest interval, but the other issue could be, are we delaying dry down because of that? And this year especially, we saw some fields that didn't get harvested, you know, in a really timely manner because things just weren't drying down and folks were having a hard time managing that harvest timing. And, you know, every point above a certain point you pay for when you're drying it in the bin. So how did those unintended economic consequences play out too?
Yeah, I mean, and I can comment on that. I mean, sometimes we have later applications, primarily to manage southern rust here, but I can see the parallels with tar spot. So applications that occur at R3 or maybe even later, we consistently see that corn is 1 to 2 points or more wetter at harvest than an application that occurred at tasseling or no application. And like you mentioned, if you're trying to have timely harvest and maybe you don't have grain bin capacity or drying capacity, those can all be very costly decisions when you're trying to, again, come back to that. What is the return on the investment for this production system?
I have a question for you guys about what you think the relative contribution of tillage and residue management is in managing tar spot in our systems. What do you think? What's your feeling?
I'll let Tamra go first.
That's scary. We have a diversity of practices and choices here. Part of the question still lies, I don't think we've seen proof yet or evidence that this fungus is surviving in the soil as well as the residue, have we? We're still waiting on some of those data. A lot of those types of research questions take years to answer, right? And so at the moment, I can't tell a difference. And that might just be a time issue that we haven't had it here long enough to really observe it for any length of time. But right now, I can't tell.
Yeah, and I can tell you, Alyssa, Kentucky is a no-till state. So any management options, those are sort of off the table here in our state because we rely so heavily on no-till for soil conservation and management, et cetera. But I can tell you, we do have some spore traps out. We are part of the National Predictive Modeling Tool Initiative, where we have some consistent trapping that goes on. And even though we don't see tar spot in the counties where we have the spore traps, we are picking up the fungus. So it is there, at least in the air. So whether that's coming from residue or just surrounding states or just moving through the atmosphere, we are able to detect it every year and have since 2019. So we were detecting it even before we had a confirmation of the disease in Kentucky. So I tell people the fungus is there. And so it's just, for me, it's really going to depend on what the environment is that is conducive for it to take hold and develop disease.
Yeah, I think that's our experience too. I did everything wrong in our field that we tried to do fungicide trials in this year. I did corn after corn, did not do anything about the residue in it, and just made sure it was surrounded by all the worst factors. And we still did not get any disease. So it really speaks to the fact that, yeah, you can have those two sides of your disease triangle, but if you don't have the third, you're not going anywhere with disease. So I think we're in a very similar situation to Kentucky with management systems, no-till, and we have small farms that are really diversified. The neighborhood effect is going to be more overwhelming than any rotation you're probably doing in your field for this.
I think another factor too we haven't touched on is that there's some evidence from other states that we've got tar spot development, or the fungus is surviving on other plant species, other grasses. And so that might help negate some of the benefits of crop rotation and some of these other management factors if we start seeing that as a widespread problem.
Mm. And here we actually also have it on sweet corn. So our growers are worried about that too. And I think there's some work being done in Florida to actually look at sweet corn varieties that might be better on tar spot, but our growers are getting it from both sides.
We saw the same thing, Alyssa. A big box home improvement store had those shocks of corn for sale, and it was loaded. Our diagnostician, Kyle Broderick, saw this, and it was before we had confirmed tar spot in Nebraska. Yet it was it was for sale in some of our big box stores, and I about flipped my lid about it. So.
Yeah. The distribution could have been from anywhere. across the country.
When we're
Yeah.
moving a lot of feedstuffs around, we're baling up a lot of residue. Not to mention the intense wind that we experience in the plains states, and so there's a lot of things moving it around.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I talk a lot with farmers that farm across the borders, right? And they're moving their combines and they're dragging that residue with them from state to state. And we actually had some plots on one of our trials. The farmer came from Illinois to harvest in Kentucky, and I was out there and I was pulling all the extra residue off the combine before it went into the field, just because I know he was in an area that did have tar spot, and in an area that, and we were going to harvest in an area that had not had it confirmed. And so those are just, that residue management, we think of it usually as tillage and crop rotation, but the movement of residue when you have these new and emerging diseases can also be an important factor. So yeah. Well, I think this has been a really great discussion. I've learned a lot, and hopefully our viewers will learn some things that they can take to their states as well. Any final comments from anyone?
I would just like to say for anyone in these states where the disease is emerging, to reach out to their local extension professionals, send samples in if you have any doubts about it, and look to the Crop Protection Network for the management recommendations like the fungicide efficacy data. Those have been tremendously useful.
Yeah, I echo those comments. There's lots of great resources out there now, especially online, but also these human resources that every state has.
Yeah, and that's a really great point, is that, there's so many people that can be the eyes and ears, and I'll speak for everyone. We love getting the samples. We love being able to have people that are out there looking in these states where it's sort of moving through, so that when we know where it is, we can do a better job of understanding the disease and learning about how to manage the disease. And so, please contact us, contact your local state extension representatives to talk about tar spot, and always the Crop Protection Network. We try to keep those resources updated with the latest information. And so that's also a very good source of information too, as you're learning about and managing tar spot in your own system.